Life has a funny way of teaching lessons to those who think they're above the rules. This is the story of Michael Thompson, the son of Riverdale's mayor, who learned this truth the hard way. Growing up in the prestigious Hills neighborhood of Riverdale, Michael had everything a young person could dream of. His family's three-story mansion stood proudly on top of Oak Avenue, complete with a swimming pool that hosted the wildest parties in town. From the day he got his driver's license, Michael's garage had been home to not one but 3 luxury cars, gifts from his father, Mayor Robert Thompson, for various birthdays and achievements. But it wasn't just about the material things. At just 23 years old, Michael walked around town like he owned every street, every building, and honestly, every person. People knew him as the mayor's kid, and boy, did he milk that title for all it was worth. Restaurant reservations. Just a quick mention of his last name, and suddenly, tables would become available. Speeding tickets. A flash of his father's business card, and they'd mysteriously disappear. The local coffee shop workers still talk about the time Michael threw a fit because his cappuccino wasn't hot enough. Instead of getting kicked out like any other customer would, the owner personally made him a new drink and offered a week of free coffee. That's just how things worked in Riverdale when you were the mayor's son. At the prestigious Riverdale Country Club, Michael had his own permanent parking spot right next to his father's. The spot wasn't officially assigned to him, he just decided it was his. And nobody dared to park there. Every weekend, he'd roll up in his shiny red sports car, toss his keys to the valet with barely a glance, and strut into the club like he was royalty. His Instagram feed was a non-stop showcase of his privileged life, poolside parties at his mansion, front-row seats at sold-out concerts, and vacations to exotic places most people only dreamed about. His followers ate it up, leaving comments like, "Living the dream," and "must be nice to be the mayor's son." Michael loved every second of the attention. But it wasn't all sunshine and roses. Behind the scenes, the town's police officers shared knowing looks whenever they saw Michael's car zoom past. The local shopkeepers would tense up when he walked into their stores, not because they respected him, but because they feared his tantrums. Young service staff at restaurants would literally play rock, paper, scissors to decide who had to wait on his table. The thing about Michael was that he wasn't always like this. Old Mrs. Henderson, his third-grade teacher, still keeps a picture in her classroom of 8-year-old Michael giving his lunch to a classmate who had forgotten theirs. That sweet little boy had somewhere along the way turned into someone who thought rules were mere suggestions and kindness was a weakness. His father's position as mayor had started as a shield, protecting Michael from the normal consequences of life. But over time, that shield had turned into a weapon. He wielded his father's name like a sword, cutting through any situation that didn't go his way. Whether it was getting into the most exclusive clubs without waiting in line, or talking his way out of parking tickets, Michael had mastered the art of using his family connection to get whatever he wanted. The town's youngsters had a running joke. What's the difference between God and Michael Thompson? God doesn't think he's Michael Thompson. People laughed, but there was an uncomfortable truth to it. His attitude had grown so big that even his childhood friends had slowly drifted away, tired of his constant reminders about his family's status and his inability to ever admit he was wrong. But karma has a patience that entitled people can never understand. It waits, watches, and when the moment is right, it strikes with a precision that no amount of privilege can deflect. For Michael Thompson, that moment was coming faster than he could possibly imagine. Little did he know that a regular Tuesday evening was about to change everything. His perfectly crafted world of privilege was about to collide head-on with reality, and for the first time in his life, his father's name wouldn't be enough to save him. The events that would unfold would not only shake Michael's world to its core, but would also become a wake-up call that would echo through the entire community of Riverdale. As the sun set on that fateful Tuesday, Michael Thompson climbed into his red sports car, completely unaware that he was about to learn the hardest lesson of his life, that actions have consequences, no matter who your father is. The evening of December 15th started like any other winter night in Riverdale. A light snow had begun to fall, coating the streets with a delicate white powder that sparkled under the streetlights. For most people, this meant slowing down and driving carefully. But Michael Thompson wasn't most people. He'd just left the Golden Lounge, one of the city's most exclusive clubs, where he'd spent the evening throwing around money like it was confetti. The receipt for his table service could have paid someone's monthly rent, but to Michael, it was just another Tuesday night. His friends, if you could call them that, were really more like followers, people who hung around for the free drinks and reflected glory of being in the mayor's son's inner circle. The night had started going downhill when the club's new bartender didn't recognize him. The nerve of her, asking for his ID like he was some random person. Even after he pointed out who he was, she'd still insisted on following company policy. Michael had made sure to speak with the manager, and he was certain that bartender wouldn't be working there much longer. Now, as he zoomed through the streets in his red Ferrari, the engine's roar echoing off the buildings, Michael was still fuming about the incident. The car's speedometer crept past 65 in a 35 zone, but he barely noticed. The few other drivers on the road quickly pulled aside when they saw his distinctive car in their rearview mirrors. That's how it should be, he thought to himself, a smirk playing across his face. The snow was falling harder now, creating a swirling pattern in his headlights. Any other driver would have taken this as a sign to slow down, but Michael Thompson had never been one to let little things like weather conditions or traffic laws dictate his behavior. He reached over to crank up his music, the bass thumping so loud it rattled the windows of nearby buildings. At the intersection of Maple and Fifth, the light turned yellow. For Michael, yellow lights were just suggestions, and red lights were merely inconveniences that applied to other people. He pressed the accelerator harder, watching the speedometer climb even higher. The light had definitely turned red by the time he entered the intersection, but he didn't care. He never cared. What Michael didn't notice was the young mother who had just started crossing at the green pedestrian signal, pushing a stroller. She froze in terror as his Ferrari blazed through the red light, missing her by inches. The woman's scream was drowned out by the roar of his engine and the pounding of his music. In his rearview mirror, Michael vaguely registered someone waving their arms angrily, but he just rolled his eyes. People were always so dramatic. That's when he saw the flashing lights in his mirror. The familiar blue and red pattern that had never caused him any real trouble before. Usually, this was just a minor inconvenience, a quick flash of his father's card, maybe a phone call if the officer was being particularly difficult, and he'd be on his way. Michael let out an annoyed sigh and began reaching for his wallet where he kept his father's business cards. But something was different this time. The police officer behind him wasn't just casually following, they were gaining speed, siren wailing now. Michael noticed more police cars joining from side streets. Seemed like a bit much for a simple traffic stop, he thought. Still, he wasn't worried. He'd talked his way out of worse situations before. Finally, after considering whether to just keep driving, Michael pulled over into an empty parking lot. The snow was really coming down now, creating a dramatic backdrop in his rearview mirror as multiple police cars surrounded his Ferrari. This was new. Usually, it was just one officer who would quickly back off once they realized who he was. As he waited for the officer to approach his window, Michael rehearsed his usual script in his head. He'd start with a casual mention of his father's name, then pull out the business card if needed. If this officer wanted to be difficult, he'd just make a quick phone call. No big deal. He'd be home in his warm bed within the hour. But as Officer Linda Reynolds approached his car, her face illuminated by the swirling emergency lights reflected in the falling snow, Michael had no idea that this routine traffic stop was about to become the moment that would shatter his carefully constructed world of privilege. The next few minutes would change not only his life, but would send shockwaves through the entire community of Riverdale. What Michael didn't know was that this time would be different. This time, his father's name wouldn't be enough to save him from what was about to unfold. The night was far from over, and karma was finally catching up to the mayor's son. Officer Linda Reynolds approached the Ferrari with steady steps, her boots crunching in the fresh snow. The parking lot had become surprisingly crowded, not just with police vehicles, but with several bystanders who had stopped to watch the scene unfold. Some had their phones out, recording what they probably thought would be just another rich kid getting pulled over. "License and registration, please," Officer Reynolds requested, her tone professional and firm. Her flashlight beam swept across Michael's face, then moved to the car's interior. The smell of expensive cologne mixed with what she recognized as alcohol wafted from the vehicle. Michael's response was a lazy smirk as he reached for his wallet. Do you know who I am? He drawled, pulling out not his license, but his father's business card. Look, let's not waste each other's time here. Just call my dad, and we can all go home. Officer Reynolds didn't even glance at the card. Sir, I need your license and registration. I clocked you going 65 in a 35 zone, running a red light and nearly hitting a pedestrian with a baby stroller. The smirk fell from Michael's face. Nobody ignored his father's card like that. Maybe you didn't hear me, he said, his voice taking on an edge. I'm Michael Thompson, Mayor Thompson's son. Ring any bells? Sir, step out of the vehicle, please. Officer Reynolds' hand moved to rest near her belt, not on any weapon, just a cautionary stance that any trained officer would recognize. That's when something in Michael snapped. The night's frustrations, the bartender who wouldn't serve him without ID, the pedestrians who dared to cross at their green light, and now this officer who wouldn't play by his rules, it all boiled over. He shoved his door open, nearly hitting Officer Reynolds, who stepped back with practiced efficiency. The crowd of onlookers grew larger, and more phones came out to record what was happening. The snow continued to fall, creating an almost theatrical setting under the streetlights. You want me to step out? Fine, Michael shouted, his voice echoing across the parking lot. But you're going to regret this. One phone call, that's all it takes, and you'll be directing traffic in the worst part of town. Officer Reynolds maintained her composure. Sir, I'm going to need you to take a breathalyzer test. Please turn around and place your hands on the vehicle. That did it. Michael's face turned red with rage. Don't you dare try to give me orders. He stepped toward Officer Reynolds, his designer shoes slipping slightly in the snow. Do you have any idea what my father will do to you? Several bystanders gasped as Michael grabbed for Officer Reynolds' citation book. In doing so, his hand struck her shoulder hard. It wasn't a punch. It was the kind of entitled shove that someone uses when they think they're untouchable, when they've never faced consequences for their actions. Officer Reynolds reacted with textbook precision. In one fluid motion, she stepped back, called for backup, which was already arriving, and gave Michael clear instructions. Sir, you are now assaulting an officer. Get down on the ground immediately. But Michael was beyond hearing reason. Assaulting? I barely touched you. You can't do this to me. You have no idea who you're dealing with. His voice had risen to a shriek that echoed off the surrounding buildings. The crowd had grown larger, their phones capturing every moment. Among them was Tom Wilson, a local news blogger who was live streaming the entire incident. The number of viewers was climbing by the second. Two more officers approached from behind Michael, their movements careful but determined. Last warning, Officer Reynolds said firmly. On the ground, or we will assist you to the ground. Michael's response was to reach for his phone. Oh, you want to see what happens when I call my father? He'll have your badge. He'll have all your badges. His fingers were trembling so much he could barely dial. That's when Officer Reynolds and her colleagues moved in. With professional restraint and textbook procedure, they took Michael to the ground. The entitled mayor's son, who had never faced real consequences in his life, found himself being handcuffed in the snow, his expensive suit getting soaked, while dozens of phones recorded every second. You can't do this, Michael kept screaming. Don't you know who I am? My father will destroy you. This is assault. You're assaulting me. The irony of his words wasn't lost on the crowd. Every threat, every attempt to name-drop his father, every moment of his meltdown was being captured and would soon spread across social media like wildfire. As Officer Reynolds read him his rights, other officers began taking statements from witnesses. The young mother who had nearly been hit at the crosswalk had followed the police cars and was now giving her account of what had happened. The snow kept falling, adding a surreal quality to the scene, the fancy Ferrari, the flashing police lights, and the mayor's son being led to a patrol car in handcuffs. This wasn't just an arrest. It was the moment when Michael Thompson's bubble of privilege finally burst. But even as he was placed in the back of the patrol car, still shouting threats and his father's name, he had no idea that this was just the beginning. The videos of his behavior were already spreading across local social media, and by morning, his father would be facing the biggest crisis of his political career. The next few hours unfolded like a rolling thunderstorm across Riverdale. While Michael Thompson sat in a holding cell, still muttering threats between calls for his father, the videos of his arrest were spreading faster than the winter storm outside. Tom Wilson's live stream alone had already reached over 50,000 views, and clips were being shared across every social media platform imaginable. By midnight, the Riverdale Police Department's phones were ringing nonstop. News vans had started gathering outside the station, their satellite dishes poking up through the falling snow like mechanical trees. Inside, Officer Reynolds was methodically completing her report, documenting every detail of the incident while it was fresh in her mind. He did WHAT. The shout echoed through the police station as Chief Williams watched one of the viral videos on his computer. The chief, a 30-year veteran of the force, had seen plenty of entitled behavior in his time, but this was different. The mayor's son hadn't just broken the law, he'd done it on camera, in front of dozens of witnesses, and then made it infinitely worse with his reaction. Meanwhile, in the holding cell, reality was slowly beginning to seep into Michael's alcohol-clouded mind. His designer suit was still damp from the snow, his perfectly styled hair was a mess, and for the first time in his life, his father's name wasn't making his problems disappear. The desk sergeant had simply ignored his demands to make a phone call to the mayor, calmly informing him that he'd get his phone call when processing was complete, just like any other arrested person. "But I'm not like any other person," Michael had shouted, his voice bouncing off the concrete walls. The other detainees in nearby cells just rolled their eyes. They'd seen his type before, people who thought they were above the law until the law proved them wrong. Around 1 a.m., Mayor Robert Thompson finally arrived at the station. The usual confidence was gone from his stride as he walked through the gathered media, ignoring their shouted questions. He'd aged 10 years in the past 2 hours, his face ashen as he watched the viral videos of his son's behavior for the first time. "I want to see him," the mayor demanded, but his voice lacked its usual authority. Chief Williams met him in his office, closed the door, and played all the footage, not just the viral clips, but the complete body camera recordings from all officers involved. The mayor sat in silence, watching his son transform from an entitled young man into someone he barely recognized. "Bob," Chief Williams said quietly, using the mayor's first name for the first time in years, "this isn't going away. We've got multiple witnesses, clear videos, and a young mother willing to press charges for reckless endangerment. Your son nearly hit her and her baby in that crosswalk." The color drained from Mayor Thompson's face. This wasn't like the other times when he'd been able to smooth things over with a phone call or a favor. His son had crossed a line that no amount of political influence could erase. Outside the station, the crowd of onlookers had grown despite the late hour and falling snow. Among them was Danny Chen, owner of the local coffee shop where Michael had thrown his cappuccino tantrum just last week. He stood quietly, recording everything on his phone, remembering all the times he'd had to calm down staff members after Michael's visits. The local news had interrupted regular programming for live coverage. Reporter Lisa White stood in the swirling snow, her voice barely containing her excitement. In an unprecedented situation, Michael Thompson, son of Mayor Robert Thompson, remains in custody following an altercation with law enforcement. Sources say the mayor himself is currently inside the station, but contrary to usual patterns, no quick release appears to be forthcoming. Social media was exploding with old stories about Michael. Servers, fillets, and shop owners were finally sharing their experiences with the mayor's son. The hashtag Riverdale Prince was trending locally, with people sharing their own encounters with his entitled behavior. Back in the holding cell, Michael had finally fallen silent. The gravity of his situation was starting to sink in. His phone calls to his usual fixers, lawyers and family friends who had helped him out of trouble before, had gone unanswered. Even his father's personal attorney had sent a brief text: "Stay quiet. Don't talk to anyone. This is beyond what I can fix." Officer Reynolds finished her shift around 2 a.m., walking to her car through a gauntlet of reporters. She declined to comment, but held her head high, knowing she'd done her job exactly as she should have. Her fellow officers lined the hallway as she left, their silent support speaking volumes about the change this night would bring to Riverdale. In the station's bathroom, Mayor Thompson splashed cold water on his face, staring at his reflection in the mirror. The political implications were already racing through his mind, but for once they weren't his primary concern. He was seeing his son, really seeing him, for the first time in years. Where had he gone wrong? When had he stopped being a father and become an enabler? The night stretched on, but sleep eluded everyone involved. In holding cells and offices, in news vans and coffee shops, in homes across Riverdale, people watched and rewatched the videos. They all knew they were witnessing something significant, not just the arrest of a privileged young man, but the moment when a community finally said enough was enough. Dawn was breaking over Riverdale, the snow finally letting up, but the storm that would reshape the Thompson family and the entire community was just beginning. Michael Thompson, the untouchable prince of Riverdale, was about to learn that some things can't be fixed with a phone call or a business card, and his father, the mayor, was about to face the hardest decision of his political career. The morning after Michael's arrest, Mayor Robert Thompson sat in his home office, staring at his phone as it buzzed nonstop with messages. The sunlight streaming through the windows felt harsh and unforgiving, much like the public's reaction to last night's events. His coffee had gone cold, untouched, as he watched the morning news coverage of his son's arrest play out on every local channel. Breaking news from Riverdale, the TV anchors announced repeatedly. Last night's arrest of Mayor Thompson's son has sparked a citywide debate about privilege and accountability. The viral videos, which have now reached over 1 million views, show. He muted the TV, unable to watch the footage again. His son's voice, twisted with rage and entitlement, had played on repeat in his head all night. "Do you know who my father is?" Those words haunted him now, echoing what he failed to see for so many years. The mayor's phone rang again, this time from his campaign manager, Tom Bradley. "Bob, we need to get ahead of this." Tom's voice was urgent. "I've drafted a statement. We'll say Michael was under unusual stress, maybe blame it on the pressure of being in the public eye. We can spin this." "No." The mayor's response surprised even himself. "No more spin, Tom. No more fixes." He hung up, leaving his longtime campaign manager staring at his phone in disbelief. Outside the Thompson mansion, reporters had gathered like moths to a flame. The family's perfectly manicured lawn, still covered in fresh snow, was now trampled by camera crews and journalists. The iron gates that had always kept the world at bay seemed less imposing now, more like prison bars than protection. At the local diner, every TV was tuned to the news, and every conversation centered on the Thompson family. Mary, the diner's owner who had served the community for 30 years, watched her customers' reactions with interest. She remembered when Michael was just a little boy, coming in with his father for Saturday morning pancakes. Where had that sweet kid gone? "I always knew something like this would happen," one regular customer said, stirring his coffee. "You can't raise a kid thinking they're above the law and not expect it to blow up eventually." The mayor's office was in chaos. His staff huddled in small groups, whispering about their job security and the future of their political careers. Sandra, his assistant of 15 years, sat at her desk fighting back tears. She'd watched Michael grow up, made excuses for his behavior, and now felt partly responsible for what he'd become. Around noon, the mayor received another call, this time from his wife, Patricia, who was at their lake house trying to avoid the media circus. "Robert," she said, her voice trembling, "what are we going to do? Can't you make this go away like before?" The silence that followed her question spoke volumes. Both of them knew this time was different. This wasn't a parking ticket or a noise complaint. Their son had assaulted a police officer on camera, endangered a young mother and her baby, and the whole world had watched it happen. At the police station, Chief Williams was holding a press conference. "The law applies equally to everyone in Riverdale," he stated firmly, his voice carrying across the crowded room. "No exceptions, no special treatment, no matter who you are or who your family might be." The mayor watched the press conference on his office TV, noticing how many of his former allies stood behind the chief, their faces grim but determined. These were people who had helped him sweep Michael's previous incidents under the rug, but now they were drawing a line in the sand. By late afternoon, the mayor had received calls from every city council member, each one carefully distancing themselves from the situation. His political capital, built over years of service, was evaporating like morning dew under a harsh sun. But something else was happening too, something unexpected. As Mayor Thompson read through the flood of emails and social media messages, he noticed a pattern. Mixed in with the criticism and calls for resignation were notes of sympathy from parents who understood his struggle, who had faced their own challenges with troubled children. One message particularly caught his eye, from a retired judge. Sometimes the kindest thing we can do for our children is to let them face the consequences of their actions. It's never too late to do the right thing, Bob. As evening approached, Mayor Thompson sat down at his desk and began to write. Not a political statement or a carefully crafted press release, but a letter to the citizens of Riverdale. His hands trembled slightly as he typed. To the people of Riverdale, for years, I have failed not just as your mayor, but as a father. In trying to protect my son from the consequences of his actions, I have instead protected him from the chance to grow into a responsible adult. Last night's events were not just a failure of judgment on Michael's part, but a wake-up call for me as a parent and as your elected official. He paused, tears blurring his vision. For the first time in his political career, he was writing something completely honest, without considering the political implications. Outside his window, the sun was setting over Riverdale, casting long shadows across the city he'd sworn to serve. The mayor knew that whatever he wrote next would change everything, for his family, for his career, and for the city. But for the first time since this crisis began, he felt something close to peace. Sometimes, he realized, the hardest decisions are also the most necessary ones. The courthouse steps were packed with people on the morning of Michael Thompson's hearing. 2 weeks had passed since the arrest, and Riverdale had changed in ways nobody could have predicted. The morning sun cast long shadows across the gathered crowd, a mix of reporters, curious onlookers, and citizens who felt they needed to witness this moment in their city's history. Inside the courthouse, Michael sat beside his attorney, looking nothing like the entitled young man from the viral videos. His designer suit had been replaced with a modest dark blue one, and gone was the smirk that had once seemed permanently etched on his face. 2 weeks in jail, with his father refusing to post bail, had started to chip away at his facade of invincibility. Mayor Robert Thompson sat in the front row, alone. His wife had chosen to stay at the lake house, unable to face the public scrutiny. The mayor's face showed the weight of the past 2 weeks, the sleepless nights, the difficult decisions, and the painful realizations about his role in his son's behavior. All rise, the bailiff called out as Judge Catherine Wilson entered the courtroom. She was known throughout the district for her fairness and unwavering commitment to justice. The mayor had never felt more grateful that this case had landed in her courtroom. The proceedings began with the prosecution presenting their evidence. The videos played on the courtroom screens, Michael running the red light, nearly hitting the young mother and her baby, his confrontation with Officer Reynolds. The footage felt even more damning in the formal setting of the courtroom. Your Honor, District Attorney Peter Collins began, the evidence before us shows not just a single moment of poor judgment, but a pattern of behavior enabled by privilege and a belief in being above the law. The state recommends. Michael's attorney, David Wright, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He'd been the Thompson family's lawyer for years, but this time was different. This time, the mayor himself had instructed him to let justice take its course. When it was time for character witnesses, something unexpected happened. Officer Linda Reynolds stepped forward. The courtroom hushed. Nobody had expected her to speak on this day. Your Honor, she began, her voice steady and clear. I've been a police officer for 12 years. I've seen countless young people make mistakes. What matters isn't just the mistake, it's what happens next. It's about accountability and growth. Michael stared at his hands, unable to look at the officer he had assaulted. For the first time, he felt genuine shame, not just regret at being caught. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. Mayor Thompson had asked to address the court. As he walked to the podium, the room fell so silent you could hear the old courthouse clock ticking. Your Honor, he began, his voice thick with emotion, I stand before you not as the mayor of Riverdale, but as a father who failed his son. For years, I used my position to shield Michael from the consequences of his actions. In doing so, I didn't protect him, I harmed him. I helped create the young man who thought he could assault a police officer and endanger a mother and child without consequences. Tears were visible in the mayor's eyes, but he continued, I'm not here to ask for leniency. I'm here to ask for justice, real justice, the kind I should have allowed to happen years ago. My son needs to face the consequences of his actions, not just for the sake of our community, but for his own sake. The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Nobody had expected this from the mayor, who had always pulled strings to protect his son. When it was Michael's turn to speak, he stood slowly, his hands trembling slightly. "Your Honor," his voice cracked, I've had 2 weeks to think about who I am and what I've done. For the first time in my life, I couldn't hide behind my father's name. I couldn't buy my way out, and I'm actually grateful for that." Judge Wilson listened intently as Michael continued. "I watched those videos of myself over and over in my cell. I didn't recognize that person, but I know it was me. I know I hurt people, not just Officer Reynolds, but so many others over the years. I can't undo what I've done, but I want to change. I need to change." After all testimonies were heard, Judge Wilson took a moment before delivering her verdict. The courtroom held its breath. "Mr. Thompson," she began, "your actions showed a disturbing disregard for both law enforcement and public safety. However, I've also seen something rare today: genuine recognition of wrongdoing and a desire for change. Taking all factors into consideration, I sentence you to 18 months in the state correctional facility, followed by 2 years of probation. Additionally, you will complete 500 hours of community service and mandatory counseling." The sentence was fair, not too harsh, not too lenient. It was, perhaps for the first time in Michael Thompson's life, exactly what he deserved. As Michael was led away by court officers, he caught his father's eye. Something passed between them, not the old understanding of how to fix things, but a new understanding of why some things shouldn't be fixed. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed around Mayor Thompson. "Mr. Mayor, do you think the sentence was fair? Will this affect your political career? What message do you have for the people of Riverdale?" The mayor looked at the cameras, his face showing both exhaustion and relief. "Justice was served today," he said simply. "And that's what every citizen of Riverdale deserves, including my son." As the crowd dispersed, Officer Reynolds walked down the courthouse steps. A young mother, the same one who had nearly been hit by Michael that snowy night, approached her with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said softly, "for making our streets safer for everyone." The sun was setting over Riverdale as the day drew to a close. Something had shifted in the city, a small but significant change in how people viewed justice, privilege, and accountability. And in a jail cell not far away, Michael Thompson began the long journey of becoming someone different from the entitled young man who had thought himself above the law. 18 months can feel like an eternity or pass in the blink of an eye, depending on how you spend them. For Michael Thompson, his time in the state correctional facility became a journey of self-discovery that no one, not even he, could have predicted. Gone were the designer clothes, the expensive car, and the entourage of fake friends. His world had shrunk to a 6x8 cell, shared with a roommate who couldn't care less about his family name. His first few weeks were the hardest: the constant noise, the strict routines, and the crushing realization that his actions had led him here. "You're not special in here, rich boy," his roommate, Pete, had told him on his first day. "But you can be better." Those words, harsh as they were, stuck with Michael throughout his sentence. He started small, joining the prison's literacy program, helping other inmates write letters to their families. For the first time in his life, Michael was doing something that didn't come with immediate rewards or recognition. The simple thank you from a fellow inmate who could finally write to his daughter meant more than any expensive gift he'd ever received. Back in Riverdale, things were changing too. Mayor Thompson had kept his position, but his approach to leadership had transformed completely. He championed programs for at-risk youth and pushed for greater accountability in local government. The community watched as their mayor turned personal crisis into positive change. Every Saturday, without fail, the mayor visited his son. Their conversations, once filled with excuses and quick fixes, became deeper, more honest. They talked about the past, the moments where things went wrong, the times when privilege had replaced parenting. "I remember when Mom left for that year," Michael said during one visit, picking at the sleeve of his prison uniform. "I was 12, and you started giving me whatever I wanted, trying to make up for it." The mayor nodded, fighting back tears. "I thought I was helping you. I was wrong, son, so wrong." Michael's counseling sessions, required by his sentence, became a lifeline. He began to understand the roots of his behavior, the entitlement, the anger, the need to prove his worth through power over others. Slowly, session by session, he started to build a new foundation for his life. One day, about a year into his sentence, Michael received an unexpected visitor, Officer Linda Reynolds. The meeting was awkward at first, both of them remembering their last encounter on that snowy night. "I wanted to see how you were doing," she said simply. "Your father mentions you've been making changes." Michael looked at her, really looked at her, seeing not the officer he'd tried to intimidate, but a person who'd been doing her job, protecting her community. "I'm sorry," he said, the words coming easily now, unlike the forced apology at his sentencing. "Not just for that night, but for who I was." Officer Reynolds nodded, seeing the genuine change in the young man before her. "Keep going," she said. "The hardest person to prove anything to is yourself." The months passed, and Michael threw himself into every rehabilitation program available. He earned his counseling certification, determined to help others avoid the pitfalls of privilege and entitlement. His fellow inmates started coming to him for advice, calling him Mr. T, not because of his family name, but because they respected the person he was becoming. Finally, the day of his release arrived. The sun was just rising over Riverdale as Michael walked out of the correctional facility carrying a small bag of belongings. His father waited by a modest sedan, not the luxury car Michael had once expected as his right, but a practical vehicle that would take him home. The Riverdale they drove through was both familiar and strange. The coffee shop where he'd once thrown tantrums over cappuccinos was still there, but now he saw it differently. He saw everything differently. His first stop wasn't home, but the community center where he'd be doing his required community service. The director, Mrs. Anderson, greeted him with cautious optimism. "We're starting a new program for teenagers," she explained, "teaching them about accountability and making good choices. Would you be interested in sharing your story?" Michael looked around the simple office, so different from the luxury he'd once known, and felt more at home than he ever had in his father's mansion. "Yes," he said, "I would." Over the next few months, Michael's story became a powerful teaching tool. He spoke at schools, youth centers, and even police academies, sharing his journey from entitled troublemaker to someone striving to make a difference. 1 year after his release, Michael stood before a group of high school students. The auditorium was packed, but he wasn't there to brag or intimidate. He was there to warn them about the dangers of privilege unchecked by responsibility. "I thought my father's name made me special," he told them. "But what makes us special isn't who our parents are or what we earn. It's what we choose to do with our second chances." At the back of the auditorium, Mayor Thompson watched his son with pride, not the old pride of position and power, but a new pride in seeing Michael become the person he was meant to be. That evening, Michael drove his used car to the local diner, the same one where he'd once demanded special treatment. He ordered coffee, waited his turn like everyone else, and left a generous tip. The server, who remembered the old Michael, smiled at the change. As he sipped his coffee, Michael caught his reflection in the diner's window. The entitled young man from those viral videos was gone, replaced by someone who understood that true strength comes not from power over others, but from mastery over oneself. Outside, Riverdale continued its daily life, but something had changed in the city. Michael Thompson's story had become more than just a tale of privilege and punishment. It had become a lesson about transformation, about the possibility of change, and about the power of facing consequences with courage and humility. And somewhere in the city, a young person watching those old viral videos would learn not just about the mayor's son who thought he was above the law, but about the man he became when he finally faced the truth about himself.